Welcome, everybody, to the Business Wingmen Show. I'm Steve Smith, and I'm joined here in studio by my co-host, Travis Smith. And in this episode, we're going to kind of talk about something that has to do with what happens when you come into a company and you don't feel like people are looking at you like you're credible, like you belong there, like however you got that job, you deserve to have it. Now, it's kind of a nebulous topic, but the reason we're bringing it up is because in a lot of family businesses today, where the owner of the family is trying to make sure that the rest of the family takes over and keeps that business going, eventually they're going to bring in the offspring, the children. And if the children haven't been there from day one, they're coming in and everybody around them is saying, okay, what's going on here? Why are you here other than the fact that your last name is the same one that's on the door? That's one exercise. Another one, which we'll get into here in a minute, which I personally got involved in with my last company, is being offered in at a fairly high level and having absolutely no background in the industry at all. So what do you do when you feel like your integrity, your credibility, the reason you're being there is being questioned? So Travis, that is a backdrop. Have you felt like that yourself? Have you known anybody before that's gotten into a company in a position for which everybody else is scratching their head and saying, why are they here?
Well, your word choice starting off in this discussion today has been fantastic.
Yeah.
Nebulous offspring. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
yeah. So I can't say that I have directly been in terms of a paid job in a situation where I myself have come in and was brought in because I was a family member and was kind of given that hey, little elbow wink. You're
Yeah.
getting the job, son. Nice job.
Yeah.
I personally haven't experienced that in my career. I have seen it though, and I have seen it quite often where
Mm,
some high-ranking person hires or brings in a buddy, a friend, a relative, or a sibling, son, whatever you want to refer to that, a close family member or confidant,
right.
and then puts them in a role routinely that they don't have a lot of experience in.
Right. Right.
Right. And so immediately the water cooler discussion that starts getting kicked around the company or the office is, oh, well, so and so, that John Smith over there only got the job because he's,
Yes.
on
Right.
the tit of the CEO or whatever it is. Right.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and that's the problem because eventually, and sometimes quickly, that gets back to the individual, and now all of a sudden they realize that everybody around them might be treating them cordially, but nobody believes that they had the right or they earned their way in.
yeah, I'll give you a good example. Company name to stay out of my example, but this is a real situation that's going on right now. There is a life sciences company in Orange County that is
Hmm.
a publicly traded company,
Hmm.
and their stock performs quite well.
Hmm.
They've been publicly traded for, I don't know, the last 5 or 6 years. It's not a huge company, but they probably have anywhere between 400 and 600 employees. The VP of sales, actually, I'm sorry, the person, she's kind of the CRO. So she runs sales for the company.
Hmm.
Now, this is a $200 million organization that's publicly traded. She has no background in management as it relates to anything that would even be remotely close to sales.
Right.
Her father is the CTO of the company,
Ooh.
right?
Okay,
So,
there's the linkage
uh,
right there.
and then if you go onto this person's LinkedIn, maybe 5 or 6 jobs over a period of a 13-year career tenure, right? So I'm not necessarily picking on that person because they're a bad person. I'm sure, you know what, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They're probably a fine person.
Right.
But I will tell you that there are a lot of people in this world that are very competent in what they do that never reach a C or VP level job within a company that's doing $200+ million a year publicly traded, right? So how did that person who has 13 years of experience, 6 jobs along the way, end up there? And
Hmm.
it's because of what we're talking about today. It's, you know, I will contend, and we've talked about this before, it doesn't matter where technology is today. It's still all about who you know. And yes, that does open doors for us. I think the bigger thing though in this conversation is you have to be aware about that door that you're walking into and what the perception is of everyone else around you, whether or not you're qualified to walk in that door or not.
Right. Oh,
Right.
yeah, because perception always leads reality. And
Right.
if everybody's perception is that you got that job for a reason other than your qualifications, your experience, your track record, anything of that nature, then they're going to automatically, again, they might be cordial, they might be professional, but there's going to be some distance there until they figure out whether they can trust you being there. And I again, I see this with the family businesses that I have worked with over the years, especially when, the next generation doesn't immediately show up. They don't start in the mailroom as we've talked about in the past, and they
Yeah,
work
kind
their
of
way
making your
up.
bones.
Right. They go to college, they get an MBA, they're out in another industry, and all of a sudden it's time for them to come in and take over mom and dad's business. And they come in at a fairly high level with some, with some responsibility and authority to make decisions and do things. And everybody else in that place who has made their bones and has developed the reputation and the trust level for doing right by the company is now looking at that and saying, what does that mean for me?
Well, I think too, if you're the owner of a company or you're C-level or senior manager, you really have to be careful about these type of decisions because the last thing you want to do is, kind of hand someone a great opportunity, a freebie, someone that, it's a family member, a close friend, confidant. And as a result of that, you then lose the trust and respect from your organization, your peers, or whatever it is, right? I mean,
Hmm.
there's a huge cascading effect that potentially can happen here. And the interesting thing is people see it immediately. It's
Right.
like a stinky cologne, right? You can smell it before you actually see the person.
Yes. Yes.
So,
I was guilty of that in college.
I mean, who wears cologne anymore? But I mean, we
Right.
digress.
Right.
So, in prep for this discussion today, I was curious about what type of studies have been done that talks about how do you enter into a situation from a business standpoint and earn people's trust, whether or not you have the experience to dictate that, right? Um, so it's a touch outdated, but HBR did a study back in 2014, and the whole study was about how you earn trust by people who report to you.
Mm.
It was really interesting, and I think today I'll rattle off a couple of these things that, they identified as kind of the key pieces. I think for most of us, when we hear this stuff, we're like, yeah, duh, kind of, makes sense.
Right.
The interesting thing though is the hubris of people who step into these roles and think that I'm in this spot because so and so put me here, I'm untouchable. That's
Hmm.
where the problems come in,
Right.
right?
Right. Yes.
So,
Now, look, I started this whole thing off by saying that I had a story that involved me in this thing. And it was the last company I went to work for, very much outside the lane that I had been in for my first three companies, but still an opportunity that was worth jumping into. And what I found after being there a while was that one of the reasons that I had earned that opportunity was everybody else that was in the company that could have moved up didn't want it. They
oh, interesting.
simply didn't want the headaches. From their own vantage point, they saw what was going down, how the company operated, kind of the pressures and the things of that nature. They didn't want it. And so when companies, especially nationally based companies, have situations where entire quadrants of the US are unmanned or at least unmanaged,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody on the inside wants to step up, what do? You got to go outside. And if your industry is somewhat cloistered in terms of upward mobility and people that are at all levels available and ready to go, you have to go out of your industry. So the next question is, what industry parallels ours for which we could get knowledge and experience that could be transferred in. That's how I got in.
And so when you took that job, let's call it your 2, 3 weeks in, did you have that feeling that you kind of had a target on your back, that people were kind of looking at you like, oh, you shouldn't be here, or, such?
No, I didn't feel the target, but what I did feel was this incredible weight of, sure, I know management, I know leadership, I know organization, planning, all these kind of skill-based things that permeate every industry. What I didn't know anything about was the industry itself, the customer base, the
Yeah.
product line, which was extensive. There's over 700 items that you had to be able to describe and explain according to their usage. So the weight of having to learn enough to just to be able to get into a conversation with a customer or one of the account managers that was floating around the West Coast was daunting. I spent 3 weeks back at the headquarters in class doing nothing but learning how to talk about the business.
So you basically had to learn 700 SKUs. That's
Yeah.
what you're saying. That's
plus
insane.
the merchandising, plus the just the training that goes into the clients so that they could represent your products.
Yeah.
I mean, everything downstream of that, plus the company's, how the company operates, how decisions are made, how money is spent. I mean, it was fascinating, but at the same time, it was literally like going back to school. And I had to do that because if I had gone just from hiring into the workplace and just started, nobody would have bought off on anything. In fact, I made tons of mistakes in my first year that I know people were laughing at because they were like, well, if you knew the difference between this and this, he would never have done that. But he did it because he doesn't know.
But I will also contend that those nuances, and by the way, real quick, another fantastic word choice you had, cloistered. So good. I mean, we should just put a board up on the side here of these
Right.
wonderful word choices.
Right. Yoast terms. Right.
Yoast term. Another one, Yoast.
Right.
So, when you get into those nuances, how important really is it to be an expert at that level? I don't necessarily know if you need to be, because that's why you have other people within the company that perhaps they have that SME background, right? I think the bigger thing is when we're brought in for management purposes, it's to lead, to encourage, to help people break open new markets. If you're in sales, it's more of a people focus rather than a product focus, right?
And I will totally agree with you up to a point. And when you have managers below you that are coming to you to kind of help figure out issues that they've got going on, maybe with competition, maybe with a major customer who's teetering on leaving for whatever reason, when you have all those kinds of dynamics at play, when they come to you and they get into a conversation with you, they want to feel like you know enough about what's going on to be credible in your advice, your guidance,
Sure.
whatever. And if you're talking crazy stuff and they're like, well, he has no idea what we do, they're like, okay, I need to go find somebody else because I can't go to my boss. He doesn't understand the very business that they've asked him to run.
Right. So I want to go back real quick to what I had brought up with this HBR study and some of these
Oh, yeah.
perhaps intangibles, right? Of if you're coming in, you're taking on a role, and whether it's fair or not, there perhaps is a perception. The reason why you're there is because you know someone up on high.
Right.
These are the things that through this study, and again, 2014, that they identified as this is where you want to spend your time and this is how you want to operate to get over that hurdle and hump. So I'm going to blow your mind away with this first one. Are you ready?
All right.
Be transparent and truthful. I know, let that sink in. I mean, the fact that they did a study to then determine that when we go into a new job, if we operate transparently and truthfully, that will gain the respect of our peers. I mean, that right there was worth whatever money they spent on that study. I mean, if that's not common sense, then we should fire ourselves, perhaps. But
I think there's other perspectives out there, especially in new jobs, depending on how high up the job is, that people have acclimated to over the years. And one that comes to mind is this phrase that goes like this: better to stay silent and have people think you don't know rather than open your mouth and remove all doubt. So it's the whole idea that if I don't really know, I shouldn't really advertise it. Now, being transparent means going on the offensive and saying, look, guys, this is an area I'm not familiar with, so I need to rely on you to help me understand what's going on so I can help you. And I totally buy that. I think it's a very credible, authentic way to work your way in. But it takes a little bit of confidence to do that. And I think a lot of people, they don't resort to that right off the bat. The first thing is, okay, if I can hide the fact that I don't know anything, then maybe people won't pick it out.
And I think you hit that spot on. There's a fair amount of folks in management who operate under this notion that because they're there, they have to know every little nuance of every little thing.
Yes.
And the reality is that's just not the case. Because if you did know every little thing and could do everything, why need employees?
Well, yeah.
Right? You could just do it all.
Right. Right. So you're right. Yeah. You have to, I think you've got to be willing to kind of, and not wait for people to call you out on it, but just step forward up front and say, look,
right.
I'm learning the ropes. There's things that I can provide, but I'm going to have to count on you to fill in the gaps with some of the details that I'm not aware of.
This is my truth.
This is my truth. Yeah.
So a couple other things that, if you can tell by the tone of my voice, I'm being quite sarcastic as I'm explaining these outcomes from the study because, and again, 10 years old, so maybe it was groundbreaking back then. I highly doubt that, but a lot of
For
this
some people, it could be groundbreaking right now as we're speaking about it.
Maybe. So encourage rather than command. Oh, okay, that's a novel idea. But, when we go in, and we actually had a discussion about this on the podcast here a couple episodes ago about one of the worst things management can do when they're brand new to an organization is immediately just start going in and doing the whole command and conquer bit.
Yes.
Yes, I get it. There are some times, perhaps unique times, where the organization is just a mess and it needs somebody to come in there and shake the tree, and just get rid of all the bad apples. I get it. I just don't know if that is the norm. I know that does happen. I think the bigger piece, though, is you've got to come in and give it some pause and some peace before you start ripping things apart. You also have to put the people who are there and who do their jobs well in a position to where they can perform their job well, which is through encouragement and support. If you're just constantly telling people what to do, well, why did you hire them in the first place, right?
Well, okay. So in the family business arena where this happens, that's a great point because you always have the authority that your role comes with that you can execute when you need to. But that's not the first thing I would recommend people pull out of the bag. The first thing I would pull out of the bag is getting to know folks, building a relationship, developing an alliance so that you win people over to your side before you have to, start being authoritative, command and control, stuff like that. There's always going to be situations where that's necessary. And sometimes people will look to you for that because they don't have the authority and they don't want to do it. They're looking for somebody else to lead the way. But up until that point, if you just go charging up front and you don't look behind you, you're going to find nobody's following. And sometimes that's a way for new managers early on in their career of that new job to tank themselves completely because they get so far away from the rest of the group. Let's face it, you got an employee, a department of 10 people and nobody's following you. Senior management is going to look at that and say, okay, what's going on here?
Right.
We can't replace 10. Maybe we just need to replace the one we just hired and find somebody who does a better job of circling the wagons and getting everybody to follow them.
Absolutely.
So
another outcome of this study was take blame and give credit.
Yeah.
So I look at that and I don't necessarily think that that's common sense. And that's just from a lived experience on my end. I see a lot of people in management, even today, where something happens within the organization and they immediately are looking for scapegoats. They're running and hiding. It's But then when something great happens, unfortunately, they're taking the credit for that. So
Right.
I agree with this statement wholeheartedly, where if you're coming in, regardless of how you came in, but you want to make sure that people are viewing you from a lens of this is the right person for the job. And then you're from that building respect. One of the best ways you can do that is through simple recognition, giving people their moment based on good work, right?
Hmm.
And that
Yes.
kind of goes into another thing that came from this study, which was they identified that playing favorites perhaps is not a great thing to do. And this goes back to the piece you brought up, which is if it's a family business and so I'm the owner, I bring my daughter in, and my daughter is now doing something, whatever it is. If I start playing favorites with her, giving her the accolades, even though maybe she didn't deserve it,
Right.
or just talking about her more
Right.
than other folks, that immediately is going to set a tone within the organization that somebody perhaps who is undeserving, but is my family member, is the one that's getting the credit. That's a
Yes.
great way to sink a ship really quick.
Yep. No question. And even as the new person in, and I'll tell you this happens, and it's a human factor when you're trying to meet people and get to know people and figure out who's an early adopter of you being in that role. There's a tendency to want to kind of saddle up with certain folks that you feel like have made a connection very quickly. And because you're doing is trying to come in as one person that doesn't know anybody and ingratiate yourself within the group in some fashion. But if you don't continue to work on everybody else and you just stick with those two or three people who have identified you as somebody they want to get close to really early, then everybody else is okay. Well, he's kind of developed his posse, and now those are the people he's going to be favorites with.
In that situation, that scenario you just shared, when that happens over a lengthy period of time, unfortunately, the people that we end up losing in the organization are the people who are really competent and good at their job.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
ones who, and look, I hate to talk like this, but it's life. There are people within companies just who are not great at their jobs. I'm not saying they're terrible, but they're C players, B players, and every organization has them.
They're just not the best fit for that role.
Right. Those are the people who end up sticking around.
Yeah.
Right. So, uh, one of the last things that came as a result of this HBR study that was done on how you earn employees' trust, especially as you're going into a new job. This one I actually thought was interesting. And again, I don't necessarily know for a lot of people, I would put this in the bucket of common sense,
Hmm.
but it's this idea of very quickly, and they didn't really outline a specific time period for this, but very quickly being able to show competence. And this goes
Mm.
back to the story you shared earlier in the discussion about, I was 2 or 3 weeks into this job, maybe a month in, and I had to go back to the corporate headquarters for 3 weeks and learn everything about the organization, 700 SKUs, how the organization spent money, how we made decisions. That is a development of competence. You might not know everything, but as a
Right.
result of that investment in spending the time to get up and running, people will start to see that pretty quickly.
Right. And I will say, because this is something that in my own practice, I work with a lot of clients on. Um, if you want people to think you are competent and you think you have the ability to think critically through situations, even if you don't have a depth of knowledge at that point, the best way to do that is ask questions of other people. You've been here before. What do you think? If you were in my shoes right now, what would you do? You're calling on them to display what they know, which people will very graciously tell you. But when that conversation's over, many times they'll walk away thinking, wow, that guy was great. He didn't force me to do something that he doesn't know how to do and I wouldn't do, but because he's got the stripes, he has the ability to do that.
I
And I think
I
that's, yeah.
I agree with you wholeheartedly on that with one small twist there. You have to be somewhat discerning and careful how much you do that because Let's just say John Smith starts a new job, and his second week in the job, he has sat down with everybody on his team. He has 8 direct reports, and these are all mid-level management folks. And he has said that same thing to them.
Hmm.
You're the expert. I don't really know what I'm doing here. Can you teach me what's going on? You have to be somewhat careful with that message, only because if you do it too much, it may have the reverse effect, which is people saying, this guy's openly admitting he has no idea what he's doing, right?
Oh yeah.
So I think your message, what I take away from that is pick the areas where you're a fish out of water,
Right.
but it's
Right.
important for you to, uh, you know, obtain that knowledge base. Don't do it with everything, right?
Right. And learn when you do that, when you open up and you inquire as to other people's insights on things to help you make the decision, you have to be able to hold them accountable for what they're telling you. Because there's going to be somebody somewhere along the line that's going to slip you something that's not right. Maybe purposefully, maybe, because they just want to look good and they don't want to say they don't know what they're doing. So they tell you something they don't know about. That can only happen once. Even in your infancy in roles, you have to be able to let people know that you're willing to work with them, you're willing to collaborate, you're willing to bring them in so that they can have, some role to play in the decision and how things go forward. But they only get one slip up. Because otherwise, then there's no reason why they can't tell you what they want you to hear because it serves them.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So,
So I want to, before we kind of close things up here, I want to go back to a comment you had made earlier, which is a little bit of a sidebar from this discussion, but I think we can kind of weave it back in here. So bear with me. You had made a comment at the beginning of this discussion more towards this idea of making your bones,
mhm.
right? And I think what you referenced was more, hey, back in the day, even when you graduated college, sometimes you had to start in the mailroom,
Right.
right? And
Right.
that wasn't considered a bad thing.
Yes.
That was, I'm going to start in the mailroom. I don't even know if mailrooms still exist, but we'll use that as an
Probably
example.
not.
But I'm going to start in the mailroom because that's a foundational step for me to then understand the way the business works, to then hopefully work my way into other areas of opportunity.
Right.
Can you share with our listeners just why is that important? And why do people, especially if someone's listening today, they're in college, why is that something they need to do in order to help grow their career positively?
Yeah. I, I think even though it's a very traditional approach to looking at people who have earned their way, okay, they rightly deserve the promotion they got. They're authentic, they're credible. People understand. Yeah, that the reason she's there is because of XYZ. It all has to go back to, do people feel like you've paid your dues?
Hmm.
You know, did you learn everything you needed so that not only are you credible and confident in the role you are now, but everybody else sees the same thing? And sometimes when people skip steps or come in high, and the only reason people think that happened is because your last name and the company last name are the same, there's a tendency to think you didn't pay your dues. You short-circuited the system. There's something unfair about that. If I know you paid your dues and you did all these things along the way to now learn what I have gone through, now I can look at what the situation you're in and say, okay, yeah, you earned it. So I think there's a certain amount of unfairness that crops up in people's heads when they feel like folks haven't gotten to the point where they're at legitimately.
I really like the way that you describe that, which is this word earning,
Yeah.
right? It's not only is it helping you build a good work ethic, but it's also teaching you the right way to do things. So hopefully, if this is your track from a career perspective, once you're in business yourselves and you're in management, you will do that same thing for other people, meaning giving them that opportunity to earn their way up, right? And I'll share a quick story with something that I actually just heard with one of our employees over here. His family has a family business in air conditioning.
Mm.
mostly on the commercial side. But this family business is now in its second or maybe even third generation.
Okay.
Well, the owner of the business today, which is the father of my employee, this man has three sons. Two of the sons are in the business.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reason I share this story is because the way this father operates is in order for their sons to get into sales, which is in that business that's a little bit more of the lucrative role to get into,
Mm-hmm.
they had to be a technician for 2 to 3 years.
Yes. Earn your
Right.
way.
And so this company, my guess is in the area of kind of 30 to 50 employees.
Mm-hmm.
But what that reminded me of was how important it is before you get into some of these, up the ladder roles,
Right.
that you understand the foundational parts of the business and you've earned your way into it. And the
Right.
best way to do that at times is to start from the bottom. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And look, I'll give you a similar story, but a different way that it kind of came about. Years ago, one of my clients was in the commercial printing business, and it was a fairly good size company. And he had two kids. One decided they didn't want anything to do with it. The other one was interested. And he told his son, he said, before I'm going to bring you in here, not only do you need to finish your education, but you
Mm,
need to go out and work for someone else for 3 years. After you've done that and you're still interested, I will bring you in. And he told me the reason that he did that was because he saw too many situations where family members were brought in, like sometimes right out of high school. They need a job, bring them in. Okay,
mm,
there's nothing wrong with that if you're willing to go the long route. But he goes, too many people, when you try to bring people in at higher roles, automatically say, well, he has nothing to offer. Why are you bringing him? Oh, he's your son. So now bias
right.
is leaked into the workplace. And he said, you
Absolutely.
get your education in something that will help this company. Go work for somebody else and understand what it's like to work in another industry, in another company. And after that, if you still want to come back, now you have something to contribute. And I thought that was a great way to look at it. And you know
I
what?
love that.
Everybody else said, yes, if he comes in with an IT degree and he's worked for a big, database company and he comes back and he can contribute to the way our printing now has to go from,
Mhm.
from paper to digital, bring him in. Because now he had value.
I love that. And that's the way it should be done.
Yeah.
There's nobody's saying that if you have a family business or you're at a C-level role within an organization, there's no one saying that you can't bring in a family or a friend if it's an appropriate fit. But if you're going to do that, really would encourage you to look at all the angles before you do that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what that tells me is that if you running a legacy business now, meaning, your father, your grandfather, whoever started it, now it's your turn and you want to keep it going, you got to start planning that early. You got to plant the seeds early. You've got to figure out maybe your kids don't want it. There's a lot of kids today that don't want to jump in and do the business. And if that's the case, you've got to figure out what you're going to do with it. But
Yep.
start thinking about that early. Don't, think, oh, gee, my daughter graduated from college. She needs a job. She's got big loans to pay for. Bring her in. People do that, but I'm just saying, think about the ripple effect of what that creates, especially if the child you're bringing in is looking at it as a job and getting a fairly good salary for that, but doesn't have any interest long term in taking over the company.
Right.
So,
Good
all right,
discussion today.
yeah, and thanks for referencing that article because I think that really added some third party expertise to what people should really be thinking about. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of our episode. So, as always, thanks for joining us today. We will be back to you next week, as we always do on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., not only with the audio version of this podcast, but also now our video version. If you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, The Business Wingmen, we now have all of these episodes. We're loading up. We're loading up plenty of shorts. So if you want to just get us 60 seconds at a time, there's plenty of that there as well. So thanks for being with us here. We will talk to you next week with some more great material from the Business Wingmen. Take care.